Hi, I'm Dr. Stella Iwabu of Department of Health Sciences at Cleveland State University. I want to ask if you will consider if enough consideration is being made to people with disability in terms of education and also their HIV/AIDS prevention needs. Because, for example, in the 2 years that I've been disabled, I was in an accident and became disabled. In the 2 years that I've been disabled, no doctor, nurse, therapist, or anybody had had any conversation with me on sexuality. It's almost as if people with disability have no sexuality and should not have any need for education.
You raise serious issues, and we're aware of them. I wish I had the solution. I think that one of the things that's humbling about traveling around the country is we hear about a lot of challenges, and so we're not meeting all of them perfectly. I mean, stepping out of HIV, I think when we saw what happened with Katrina and the evacuation, we really weren't prepared to deal with people with disabilities and evacuating from a hurricane. And there's lots of things. When I talk to my friends with disabilities, just basic things like going to a doctor and being examined. They don't have appropriate equipment to lift people out of wheelchairs and do different things. I think there's a lot of things we need to do. The specific issue that you raised is something I've heard as we've traveled around the country. Saying that we don't think of people with disabilities as sexual beings, or we need specialized prevention. I think what our challenge is with a national strategy is not to minimize that, but how do we write something that's strategic but that's inclusive of a broad range of groups? Because there are specialized things we need to do, not just for this broad group of people with disabilities, but people with physical disabilities have different needs than people who are deaf, for example, as well as one of the lessons we've heard from these community discussions is there are many, many populations across the country that feel that they've been ignored. We've done special outreach to the Native American community, and they have a long legacy of being marginalized. And then the Asian Pacific Islander community, the gay community. We've heard this from lots of groups. And we do need to be responsive to all of these groups. And the challenge is how can we write a strategy that recognizes that, but then doesn't lead us down this laundry list saying we're gonna do special things for different groups. But if I would welcome you, if you have specific suggestions for this, you should either tell me or email them to me, because we'd definitely love to consider them. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laureen Harbert. I'm the director of the AIDS Funding Collaborative here in Cleveland. And I think that all of us recognize the need for consensus building and compromise, but also appreciate the importance of strong leadership and unequivocal statements. And so I'm wondering, certainly in the area of HIV prevention, there are intersections with sexuality and with drug use, and those are controversial issues in our country. How do you see the National AIDS Strategy balancing the need to be unequivocal and listen to science with the tendency to need compromise and consensus building?
I think that, I've said this in the past, having this president in office doesn't make the politics around HIV go away, and we still need to balance those. We don't want to get so far ahead of Congress, for example, that people are saying, okay, we're not going to fund programs. So we have to be mindful of the politics. But what I think this president brings is a willingness to go boldly and follow the evidence. So I think the opportunity with the National HIV/AIDS Strategy is when we want to get into some of those tricky areas. For example, I mentioned the statistic early on, 2 to 3% of the U.S. population is comprised of gay and bisexual men, but 53% of new infections. We probably need to scale up our HIV prevention efforts, focus on gay and bisexual men. We've never dedicated anything close to 53% on this population. It's not that we're picking favorites, but I think the opportunity of this strategy is to build the evidence base to show why we need to do this. Why, for example, and just as one specific example, why if we're going to lower incidence for everybody, we can't do that effectively unless we make significant progress with this population. And that extends to many of the other sort of trickier issues that are sometimes culturally divisive in this country. I think our opportunity is, again, to build the evidence base.
Mr. Crowley, I think it's correct, if we look back historically, that the AIDS crisis was one of the first instances in which our country, and arguably the world, was forced to reckon with a public policy issue that at its very heart dealt with not only intimate issues, but issues of sexuality, that were, from the eyes of the general public, maybe peculiar or something out of the ordinary. And we've had 20 or 30 years, whatever it is now, to try to learn how to talk about this. You're fresh from a dozen or so national forums, and I wonder how you think we're doing as a culture in our ability to raise these super sensitive topics and be forthright in our public discussion of them, right down to intimate personal details.
I guess I would have two ways to answer that. One of the things I mentioned, we had a youth and HIV meeting at the White House just last week. And maybe it's because I'm no longer a youth. I used to kid myself that I was a few years out of college, and half my life ago I was out of college for several years, so I'm not close to a youth. But I am sitting in this meeting and just thinking, when I was that age, we could not have had anything close to this kind of conversation anywhere, but let alone that these young people felt comfortable in the White House talking about these issues. So I think it shows that we've made progress. But on the contrary, I also know that when we visited the Virgin Islands and was told, well, they didn't have gay people there, and there was a real reluctance, not even that issue, but a reluctance to talk about HIV. So we managed to get, I was on St. Thomas and we had about 30 people for our community discussion, and we webcast it with St. Croix, and we had about 40 people there. Unlike every other discussion, we didn't have people lining up to talk and tell us. We were almost pulling people out of the audience, and we left early because the condition is so stigmatized. People didn't want to be associated with talking about HIV at all before they even got to these tricky issues that you raised. So I think we've made a lot of progress, but we still have more to do. I also think that this is one of these things, we don't solve a problem like this and then it's done. So like when I mentioned this Act Against AIDS campaign, we need to do this stuff on an ongoing basis. And some of our challenges is just to help people become more comfortable talking about sexuality and other things. One of the things that's interesting is to watch, the baby boomer generation, that now they have the same challenges that their parents did in many cases, talking to their kids about sex. So this is an ongoing challenge that we face, but I think we've definitely made progress over the last 20 plus years.
You mentioned politics a couple of times. How do the politics now affect your work now that you're on the inside? How are you what are your thoughts about how you can affect the politics going forward? What are your thoughts on how we can affect the politics going forward?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. So this is my first time in a political position on the inside, but I've been around Washington forever, so my job before I had this was to deal with politics. I think there are some things about this president that they might sound like, or you could perceive it's sort of rhetoric, but are real for him. I think he really wants to bring the country together. I think he wants to bridge differences, whether they're partisan divides, whether they're cultural divides. And so I think in everything that he wants us to do, he will follow the evidence, but I think he really expects his staff and all of us to engage in a way that respects people. So if we're dealing with issues and some faith traditions are uncomfortable with dealing with homosexuality, that doesn't mean we need to demonize those. So I think there's a way we can do this, and that's not to say politics are bad, that you have to take these issues into consideration. We're in a diverse democracy, and I think that's an important thing about how we need to approach our work. I'm not sure that answers your question, but those are some thoughts. Thank you.